Greetings and hello, everybody. Welcome to the Middle Grades Conversations, sixth episode of the 2022-2023 school year. My name is Don Taylor. I teach sustainability at Main Street Middle School in Montpelier. I also am on the staff at the Middle Grades Collaborative. Our monthly conversations are about pressing issues that we see across the educational field, particularly at the middle level. And today we'll be talking more shop and about restorative practices, about themes we're seeing, and about building positive relationships at the middle level. It's also Black History Month. I want to note that, and also talk about the Middle Grades Collaborative commitment to anti-racist education. This work is sponsored by the Middle Grades Collaborative and also Up for Learning. And I'll turn it over to our first contributor, Kevin, to introduce himself.
Hi everybody, I'm Kevin Pioli-Hunt. I'm a 5A teacher on Swift House at Wilson Central School.
Hi everybody, I'm Katie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a program director at Up for Learning and happy to be here with all of you.
Hey, Kyle Chadburn. I'm a district restorative practices coach for the Orleans Central Supervisory Union. Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Meg ODonnell. I teach humanities to 7th and 8th graders at Shelburne Community School, and always love being here. Nice to see you all.
Thanks, everybody. Before we get into our conversation, I'd just like to do a quick check-in. There's been a lot of discussion, at least in the groups and the circles that I work with, about how teachers are feeling. Sorry for the interruption there, but a lot of the folks I'm talking to are discussing how teachers are doing, how their learning communities are doing. And if we could just have a quick check-in of how you're doing at this point in the school year and maybe something positive that's been happening in your learning community. Kevin?
Doing all right. I always say this when I'm on these chats, but very grateful for my team and to have those colleagues around to lean on and be in the trenches with. Something positive. It's been really nice to get back to some of our traditions that we wanted to hold on to. For instance, we had our open house recently where students did an independent project and were able to share their learning with the broader community. We had, I think, over 150, 200 families come through our space, and just to get, parents and families and younger siblings and grandparents back in our space was just a really special night. And you could tell that the kids were really proud of the work that they put into it.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the learning communities that I'm intersecting with right now are at this critical place of between data analysis and into action. And so it's really lovely to have the teams starting these action projects that feel really well designed and thought out, and they're about to dive into really doing the implementation. So that feels really good.
For me, this is my first year in education, but not as a classroom teacher. And so it's been interesting for me to step back into a district-wide role and to kind of have a overarching view of how teachers are doing and how students are doing. And there's definitely a lot of challenges, which I think we're going to get into later. But one of the positives that I'm seeing is that we're finally back in a place where we're ready, kind of like Kevin was saying, to commit to some future-based initiatives, things that are not just in the moment, but are really looking ahead. Where do we want to go and how do we want to get there? And so it's really nice to see some positive momentum happening.
This is why I love coming to this group, because I was sort of venting to Don at first, oh my gosh, the fatigue feels very real and palpable. And I think the kids are tired. I think my team is particularly tired. There's been some stressors that have been happening. And so being asked to say, first, see the good, it's yeah, well, there is some good stuff happening, right? And I think it is around thinking about authentic opportunities for kids. We're trying to we're trying to find our way back to authentic audiences. We did have an open house a couple weeks ago where the whole school was here. I'm in a pre-K 8 building, and we were like moaning about it and like, oh, it's going to be like late and tired. And what do we put up in the room? And the kids just showed up, and it was really lovely. And so we've been, my teammate Wendy and I have been talking about a May opportunity to have an exhibition. So we're super psyched about that. And then as a 5-8 team yesterday, we sat down and talked about the family conference that's coming up in March, and talked about sending a group of students that just cross-represent our school, so that we can let them do some of the analysis of what are some of the things we need back here at school, and have that day dedicated to doing that. So that felt great. That felt really exciting about, putting our future lenses on and seeing the possibilities of what's to come, and not staying stuck in the I'm tired whining.
Yeah, I would agree with Meg. Sometimes it gets easy to get caught in the grind. And I would say that one of the bright spots has been our project, community-based learning. So we have a really good relationship with this Just Basics program over in Montpelier. And we've been donating food, and we've been preparing and donating food to them. And then we have a volunteer program. So we had 9 kids go over this week and spend about an hour each volunteering. And it's so powerful to have the kids sort of see what's happening, in real life, and kind of see some of the challenges that folks in our community are facing, but also the way that they handle themselves. And it just makes me enthusiastic about continuing to do that. And I also feel like it provides an opportunity to sort of work with kids in a completely different environment, where we're kind of like all equals, and we're all working, and we're all noticing and observing. And I think that's been really powerful. And I think also that one of the things I've worked with Katie and Up for Learning on leadership, and continuing to bring those leadership opportunities and skills into the classroom, it seems to be really important. And that's something I'm noticing quite a bit. So that's been really good. And I just appreciate the opportunity to work with kids in some of these non-traditional structures, where kids who might not, shine in one classroom setting can really demonstrate strengths in another with other opportunities. So, I agree. It's great to see the positive. While we have Kyle here, and I also believe that Katie has a lot of background in restorative practices, I kind of want to get right to it. And this is the conversation that I've been seeing probably quite a bit over the last 2 months or so. And on our last webinar, we had a guest teacher say, how do I balance accountability and meeting kids where they are? And to me, the meeting the kids where they are is sort of that restorative approach, a non-punitive approach. And it's also about trauma-informed, equitable education and all those things that we aspire to. But at the same time, both as a parent of middle school kids and also as a teacher, you see that there's behaviors are happening that are disruptive, that are harmful, and I think schools are still struggling with how to, number one, kind of build relationships that work with those restorative approach and implement them positively, and maintain a sense of community, I guess. And so it's just something that I'm seeing is, I think there's conflict, between what teachers can do and what systems can do. And so I just wonder how people are feeling about that. And then I'd like to hear more both from Kyle and Katie about, these restorative practices and what you're seeing, and how can teachers balance, having a structured classroom with clear expectations along with the restorative approach. And so again, just kind of hear from people about what your opinion or observations you're seeing regarding that sort of duality. And then we'll get right to Kyle and Katie about, what they're seeing in their schools and how they're working on it. Kevin?
Oof, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely in the thick of it, and it's frustrating. I think Don, you hit it on the head. It's hard because I feel like we're battling the system a lot of times. I feel like the approach to some of these matters aren't helping any situation. Yeah, it's tricky because I know, like, from our standpoint, you know, we have advisory 4 days a week, and at least for one of the days we've been doing like a practice with these community circles, so it's like a regular part of just what we do, and kids are used to like the process and everything, to be proactive. And like it's disheartening where like we just did one about like the choices we make and intent versus impact, and like the stuff kids were sharing was really great and seemed really thoughtful and authentic. And then, like, you know, 2 hours later I get a response or an email from a teacher that they had off team that's like, hey, so and so just did this really outrageous thing that was super disrespectful. I was like, like, at what point are these messages going to sink in and like start making change? And that part's disheartening. And then, you know, to your point, Don, too, it's like that towing that line of holding accountability while still maintaining this trauma-informed practices and restorative approach. And what we're seeing, what's really hard on our end is, you know, we know some of these families, what's an amazing thing, for 4 years, some of them 8 years or 12 years, depending on if we have siblings. And the hardest time that we're having right now are with, and because we know the family so well, are with these kids who have like really supportive home lives, and like kind of everything's there for them. And they're the ones that are acting the worst in school in terms of like the entitlement and the disrespect and this disregard for other people's feelings. And that's been really hard because I think what we're saying and preaching at school isn't being supported at home. It's like, I think this is an ongoing struggle for teachers. How do we close that gap? And, you know, we only have these kids for a finite time during the day, but depending on the messages they're getting on social media and with their friends and at home, it's like, I think they're at this kind of disequilibrium too, of this one group in my life is sharing this one thing about how I should act and behave and think of others, and this other group who I value and respect is telling me and showing me other ways of doing that. So it's a struggle. It really is, and we're feeling it really hard this year for sure.
Great. Should I jump in here, Dawn, or were you hoping Meg would? Sure. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I love this question. And I think when there's a lot of different directions that my brain is going, mostly since with Enough for Learning, we work with so many different communities. It's really, it's a nice lens on like where people are at. And I think if I had to pull the strands of connection across the different communities, the leading ones in my mind right now are actually Williston Central School, Burlington in general, Burlington School District, and as well as Twin Valley way down south. And so these are like the several that are coming to mind right now. And I think at the root of restorative practices is really like, what is the youth responsibility within restorative practices, and how are we creating structures for, well, again, it ties back to leadership, as Dawn was talking about earlier, like how are we training peer mediators to take on some of the responsibility, not necessarily for discipline, but for restorative approaches to like how we move through things, and how are youth holding each other accountable for the things that they say and the things that they do, because they're so much more willing to listen to youth than they are to adults. And that can look like peer mediation. It can also look like justice panels too, which are a little bit more if it's a behavior that's a lot more intense, let's say, that's more of a justice panel that also has youth on it. So there are these like structural supports that I'm seeing crop up all over, or that everybody's trying to have crop up in their school communities in a lot of different places in Vermont right now. And I think it really leads into also this other thread of peer-led like learning and leadership. And that can also tie into what Kevin was talking about too, with how we are teaching them about intent and impact. Where do those student-led learning opportunities, where is there also room for those? because that's a really restorative and proactive approach as well, is youth teaching other youth things because they're so willing to listen. Another lens that I just want to bring forth into the conversation that I'm seeing as well is not only accountability for students, but accountability for teachers and administrators in the restorative process. That is like a huge request I hear from the youth voice time and time again, is we tell people about racism that's happening, or we tell people about this that's happening. And again, I know if it falls under hazing, harassment, bullying, all of these systematic approaches that we have that limit the ability for transparency. But I do wonder, and my learning curve and learning edge at the moment is around creating procedures for accountability for adults too within a restorative system. That's where my heart and mind is at the moment. And feedback for teachers and feedback for administrators that feels restorative and that they'd be receptive to. I went in a lot of different directions, but I'll pause there so other people have room.
And Kyle, just a quick second. Katie, do you want to introduce yourself real quick? Jumping on.
Sure. Sorry, I'm late, folks. Katie Farber. Hi, assistant professor at St. Mike's.
Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it. Kyle.
Yeah, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in the field of restorative practices at all. I'm learning just like everybody else is, even though I'm in this role as a restorative practices coach. I've been really fortunate to be part of the holistic restorative education program at St. Mike's. So I've been spending a lot of time recently with Annie O'Shaughnessy, Rhiannon Kim, Elijah Hawks, people who are really well versed in this. And I'm just trying my best to synthesize all of their knowledge into what I'm doing on a daily basis. I just want to take a second to acknowledge that restorative practices, as we have dubbed them, are really traced back to indigenous tradition, right? And the idea of restorative work is to bring a community together to solve problems. And I think this kind of speaks to what Katie was just talking about, that we need all members of the community to be involved in that process. And I think in a lot of spaces, restorative practices are still very adult driven, and they're not bringing the community. And a lot of the folks that are most impacted by things that are happening are still kind of left out of the process. And I think that's where sometimes things fall short a little bit, because it's still adult driven and there is a lack of transparency. I think we gain a lot of respect and there's a great opportunity for collaboration with students here that people are missing out on, whether it's through something like a restorative justice panel, or whether it's just bringing a circle together. If it's not one of those issues that has to be, held with some confidentiality, bring a circle together of people and allow there to be a public sharing of, like, this is what happened. This is how it impacted me from my perspective. Let's get this out into the community so that we can really acknowledge what the harm is that's been done, because it's hard to heal that and repair that and move forward unless we've acknowledged it. And I still think there's a lot of instances where folks are, their words or actions are happening and they don't fully understand what the impact is. They have somebody kind of tell them, but they're not hearing it from the folks who are actually most impacted by it. One thing that I'm seeing is definitely that accountability piece for adults, but I really lay a lot of that blame on systems and our systems and our policies, our procedures in our schools are still leaving this piece out. And that's what we need to do, is really go back, audit, and reframe the way we're doing business in schools from the very foundation around restorative practices, because it's not possible to do it really well unless we're doing it as the core of our daily practice. It has to be at that centerpiece. And so that's kind of where my work is kind of going in and helping with modeling practices with teachers right now, and in the, at the same time, helping to navigate some of this work with students. But what I really want to see happen more is for us to go down and look at those policies, look at those procedures, and say, how can we reframe these so that we're doing this work in a sustainable way, because I'm in 6 different buildings usually throughout the course of a week, sometimes 4 different buildings in a day. And that's, if I'm the one person who's doing this work with students, it's not gonna work. So we've got to make it something that is systemic and sustainable.
Thank you for all that, man. I've got my wheels turning. I think some of the, I'm hearing everything that you're saying, and it's just hitting home in particular. I think something that so hard for kids right now is understanding, behaviors, communication, right? So what are they trying to communicate to us? And in some ways, in COVID, we took out all those ways for kids to, I'm not saying anything new, but like we took out all those ways for kids to interact or for kids to establish leadership opportunities because we just physically couldn't let them interact. So we have this generation of a couple of years of kids that expect education to be, it's very much done to them as opposed to their engagement and investment in it. And so trying to chip away at those habits and ways that kids learn during the pandemic and undo them is definitely an uphill sludge battle. And so you've got this pressure, not pressure, but I guess it is, right? Like we are asked to uphold these academic, the rigor, and like, what are we supposed to be asking kids to perform or produce? And we have behaviors in the classroom that fight that tide every day, right? And so it's like, it's just that struggle is very real. And we have, we also, in a lot of places, I'm speaking from my experience, but right now, I am a veteran teacher. I've been at this for quite a while, and I have a lot of really brand new folks here, brand new administrators, brand new para-educators, some brand new colleagues, special educators. And so their learning curve is equally like super steep, right? And so the system, it's like, how do you impart, I guess I'm not able to articulate it, but it's like, how do we uphold what we're trying to do for kids when we, really what we need is more adults in our classroom. Really what we need is like, I need someone that can that I can move around and another adult can be in here with me so that we can catch behaviors. Today I was outside at recess and it was like, I just hung out on the basketball court, and some of the stuff that I heard was like flabbergasting. And I was like calling them on it, right? Like, hey, that's not humor. Like, let's reframe what it is that you're trying to say. What do and I'm not being articulate about it, but I guess what I'm seeing is like, it goes to what you were saying, Katie, about peer to peer, right? And what you were saying, Kyle, it's like, it seems like the system can't handle another thing. And so the folks that are in it are asked to do a lot. And I just think right now I'm feeling the just total sense of being overwhelmed. And I wish I had a crystal ball, but I think about, man, if we had more folks, if our ratio was lower, if we had better training, if we had the 4 teachers and my teammates and I committed to doing some professional development around anti-racism after school, from 6 to 8:30 through the Paul Gorski workshop, because we need it. Like we're seeing that we're not doing a good enough job. And I guess my point is that, I don't know what my point is, but I'm not sure. I just think that, we have to be continual learners. We have to lean into the learning as adults. We have to be flexible. We have to be open-minded. We can't, let our guard down and say, this is too hard, or the kids are being naughty. And, it's just like, we have to lean into it, because otherwise we're just letting them down. And that's not our job, right? That's our job is more than that.
Meg, that was super profound. Yes. Oh my goodness. Sorry, I'm really stuck on all of the things you just said. So a little bit late to the party, but some of the things that that you're saying is helping me think about meeting students where they are. So when we were in these pods during the part of COVID where you had half of the students, there was all of this, like all of a sudden there were two humans in the classroom. So I could like go to the bathroom and when the person was really upset, they could have some privacy and they could have somebody take them for a walk. And say a girl who in my class who had really intense math anxiety, like I could preview the problem with her and I could be like, hey, we're going to work on this. And look, it's just like you did this yesterday or whatever. And it just felt like much more caring and personalized and supportive. And then we also had these smaller lunches. So you had these smaller groups of kids having lunch. And yeah, sometimes they had to be facing forward and like it was kind of stressful with the mask and stuff. But the smaller environment yielded much more conversations and connections and friendships. Same for recess, we had smaller groups at recess. We had zero problems at recess. Like normal recess, you have a litany of things the entire afternoon that you have to solve. And not so during the smaller versions. And so I'm saying that because we had these things we learned, and then where we were meeting students where they are, we were giving them that community. And then all of a sudden schools now are like, well, back to like 200 kids at recess and back to the cafeteria. And one teacher, and the flexibility just kind of evaporated. So I'm thinking about that a lot. I'm interviewing teachers and thinking a lot about the pandemic and shifts. And that's something that's really rising, is that there was this focus on mental health. There was more staff, there was more resources, there was more flexibility. And then it's just like, oh, that's good. We're good now. We're done with that. And I was like, no, they actually still need so much. I get troubled with the concept of accountability versus held in like an accountable, supportive, I guess I want to say the word accountable out, a supportive, loving, caring community, right? Where they care so much about the community that then the accountability is built into it, right? Because they're part of something that's important and they feel belonging and valued. And then I had a special educator come and talk to one of my classes this week. And she said, just some beautiful ways that she's helping her learners. Are you having a worry thought? Can you tell me about your worry thought? I can see that, and then she's saying, they've got this calm corner. It used to be like the timeout, place, but now it's a calm corner. So what tool do you want to try today? Just like what tool, this is fidget tool or this, this weighted blanket thing, like, what do you want to try? So yeah, those are some of my thoughts.
Well, now, so I would just say, as a classroom teacher who also has probably more years than I care to remember, I feel like I'm in this vortex a lot of the accountability and restorative. Like, here's the accountability, here's our traditional, these are the expectations, and here are the restorative practices, and here's me being really calm, caring, and connected to kids. And, I hear a lot about the relationships building and all that stuff. And I'm kind of like spinning in the middle of all that and trying to figure out the right approach. And as folks were talking, I'm thinking about the challenges to sort of those calm conversations, the moments we had in pod. And number one, I'm thinking about time and why we went back to chopping up our day into these little bits of time. We had I thought the pod was great. I thought a soft start was great. You could have kids come in and do reading, or, you know, it was like the pressure was so dialed back, and we've reversed that a little bit. I'm also thinking about the systems and policies. And a big one for me right now is, are we just trying to get kids to comply? Like if I'm asking a kid to behave in the cafeteria, am I asking for compliance? Am I holding high expectations? Am I asking for a kid to be able to demonstrate that they can behave in a community, you know? And I had a moment today where I had to get after a kid, and I was like, how many times have I asked you to do this? And he's like, well, 4. And do I need to have like a restorative conversation, or do I need to say, dude, you know, like once is okay, twice, meh, but by the 3rd time, you know? And it's kind of that, like, how are you dealing with that? And I'm in a blizzard of those types of things like all day long, because kids are in, kids are out. I see kids for quarters now. I used to see kids, you know, in a multi-age classroom for 2 years for long, flexible block periods. And we used to be able to, you know, talk to kids and talk to families in a more measured, relaxed type of way, right? It was the long game. And so this idea of systems and what we're wreaking with the, you know, what we're laying out in terms of our systems is in a lot of ways responsible for how teachers are behaving. The other thing I'm thinking a lot about too is initiative fatigue. So I teach a class on personalized learning, and for the first time, I'm teaching that as a historical class, because so many people are not, you know, remember 2013 X77, that's what all we were talking about, right? PLPs and personalized learning and relationships. None of that stuff is out of date. It all makes so much sense. And in fact, personal learning plans are still required by the EQS in Vermont, right? But we're not focused on that anymore, right? And so the whole heart of that was was relationships, identity, and, you know, all this great work we were doing around principles and values and relationships, et cetera. So again, initiative fatigue. And I think this heads into that accountability piece, or I'm not sure, Katie Farber, how we term that, but you have some teachers are like, I don't have time for the restorative practices, or I don't have time to listen to students. You know, I have to get through my curriculum. And so the second piece is the curriculum versus the relationship piece. And I see that that's a real conflict. And then on a deeper level, if I had time to really dig into it, like what's the white supremacist aspect of all this as well? Like, what's our compliance? What do we want kids to be doing? What is that, you know, who's demanding that they're doing that? And also, what kind of language are we using when we're talking about this stuff? When I say, oh, I'm holding kids accountable, what does that really mean? Like, am I, you know, striking fear into kids to act a certain way because I believe that's what they need for the future? Or is it something different? And so, again, just to summarize, it would be like systems and policies. Agree with Kyle. It'd be initiative fatigue. Where did personalized learning go? That's kind of a big question for me. And then also this idea of, you know, a white supremacist culture, and is that what we expect from kids? Because after COVID, kids are just not prepared to deal with that, and they're rebelling against that. And I don't think we're addressing it in a way as best we could. Meg, did you have a comment?
I did. Well, it's just something I'd written down earlier. I don't know if it came from Katie or Kyle, but it got me thinking about the language that we use with kids, right? Like, and the knee-jerk response, right? Versus like taking the moment to slow down. And if we don't have a common language, I think something that I notice here. So we don't have a common language about how we engage with kids when they're struggling. We don't have this like 2 or 3, you know, maybe posing a question as opposed to making an accusation. And so it becomes already, it just sets it up, right? It's already a setup. And without that being consistent across the board, everything becomes so fear-based that I think you see why if teachers are tired and they're tapped, and then they don't necessarily have the right language or the right training or the conversation to know how to navigate this well and equitably, we resort to our own fight or flight. And I think that's something that I see happening, is that and we don't then use that language with kids. Like, we should be developing it with kids, so we can say, okay, what happens when we start to see this, so that kid to kid could happen, right? Like, if there was a way to develop a common language about how we talk about the things that land hard, then it might, I don't know, just might make things seem a little more concise.
So I think,
More
I mean,
effective.
people have, obviously this, we're not gonna, I don't know where we'll get to in terms of this conversation, but I guess one of the questions that I would have, especially, I'll start with maybe Kyle and then Katie, because I know that you have more of a background than I do about, the restorative practices. But I guess as you're seeing teachers, or you're hearing about, these types of challenges, what are some recommendations? And like, beyond like restorative circles, because I think most of us are using that type of tool, but what would you recommend for teachers who are in this struggle and who are working on a day-to-day basis and who are going home exhausted and spent and emotionally, like Meg said, tapped out? I mean, this is a real thing. Like, I'm talking to teachers in 3 to 5 year window, and they're just like, how am I supposed to make this a career? And so I guess, Kyle, we'll start with you, and, just some bullet points or some suggestions, and then Katie, and then we'll just open it up for a kind of a final discussion.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing, Don, with teachers, that, it's just the idea of a 25 to 30 year teaching career just seems like it's out the window now. It's just not a thing for folks that are coming into education. And I'm not sure that there's any one or two tools that we can do to fix that, but some of the things that I think, just hearing what you all have shared and thinking about, so what do we do about that? I think one piece that I would recommend is to let yourself go back to that pandemic mentality. If we don't have to push all the time, ultimately, if we're doing what's best to serve students, I don't think anybody's going to come for your head, right? So if you let yourself kind of back off a little bit and take the time during the day, and I think you're right, Don, restorative circles or community building circles have become pretty common practice. I wouldn't say they're universal yet. So that's something to work on, but where else can we weave that process into our day with other, purposes in mind, so that we're not just coming together when there's a problem, but we're coming together as a community to discuss something that we're learning about. We can come together as a circle for that and practice that process. We can come together midday just to do a quick check-in and say, how's everybody doing? And that's really informative, and at least in my experience, to just do a quick little, like, what kind of weather are you feeling like right now? Or here's a bunch of emojis up on the screen. Which one best, shows how you are right now in this moment? And then we can come together as a community to support those that are, saying, I didn't sleep last night and I'm exhausted. I don't know how I'm going to get through these next 2.5 hours, or I'm feeling really frustrated and the whole morning's really gone badly. And that's not your fault, but you're going to get the brunt of it because you're who I'm with right now. Right. So just coming together as a community as often as possible, and giving those opportunities for students to be transparent about how they're feeling and what they're dealing with. Sometimes just being able to get that out in the open is a step in the right direction, and just lets them kind of purge that from themselves. And it's not something they always get a chance to do. And then the other piece that I'll mention, just because I don't want to take up too much airtime, is the idea of language. I think came up quite a few times in what you all were saying. And that's something I've been thinking a lot about and talking to people a lot about as I do this work with restorative practices, because I think that's a huge thing that's easy to overlook, is just the power of language and how we reframe things with the words that we choose to use. So, whether it's something as small as in the past, having students leave the classroom to reset and saying it's a timeout. Well, the word out implies that you're being removed from this community. And generally speaking, I don't see a whole lot of processing that happens before that person returns to the community, right? And so you've been sort of pushed out of this space that's supposed to be safe and welcoming to you, and never really had a chance to understand, how do I come back in and be more successful? Or how do I come back in and, kind of make amends for what caused me to leave? So just reframing that as a needs assessment, and having a purpose for that student to leave the classroom and go and think about, okay, so what is it that I need right now that I'm not getting, that's causing this to come out through my words and actions? And, reframing it as needs assessment versus time out could make a difference, and that goes all the way up through our traditional disciplinary techniques. I don't think, and there's a lot of research about this, that it's not about changing what we're doing, it's the changing of why we're doing it, right? So sometimes, we know the research behind suspension, expulsion, and the school to prison pipeline, right? People who are suspended from school are statistically more likely to end up incarcerated later in life. It's just the way that it is. Part of that, though, I think, is not so much the act of suspension, it's the fact that we're using that to remove somebody from a community without giving them the chance to reintegrate in a way that's going to bring them back in and make them a valuable part of that community. So they're forever outside. They're forever that person who was asked to be away. And so if we reframe suspension, it's not that we don't use it, but it's because we do need that at times. We need that person to be out so that the rest of the community can go through the healing process, right? And then you can bring that person back in. But what's that reintegration process look like? And how do we reframe the language so that we're not saying you're suspended, you're gone, we're trying to get rid of you for a while, and thinking about how do we use language that says, right now what you need and what we need is a short period of separation so that we can all heal. And then a reintegration where you're welcomed back into that space through a process in which you can become part of this community in a positive way again, and we can feel comfortable inviting you back in. So I just think there's a lot to be said about the power of language and how we can reframe some things. And I know the first thing that comes up anytime I say this is, where do we get the time to do that? How is that happening? So the other part that I would say is just, we need bodies in the buildings to support the work. We have a lot of folks who are in buildings, I'll just speak from my experience in my district. There's a lot of folks who are in the buildings doing things like literacy intervention and math intervention. Where is our restorative practices interventionists, right? Where are those folks? Where are those people who can either process with students and do some of that work to help them understand what their needs are and how we can better meet their needs and what they need to do, what their part is in that process, how they can step up? Or that person can step in to cover a classroom while the teacher can go and do that processing, which I think is even better, because then you actually get to have that relationship building communication with that student and show that you're the one who wants to help them move forward. So I think there's definitely a need for more folks who are focused on this work in our school buildings to be able to support teachers who are already doing about 1,000 jobs too many.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Katie Ingraham?
Yeah, I am excited about this question, and I was thinking, like, what would I have needed to remain in a school system too, as a teacher? And so I really like that invitation in many ways, and thinking about the level of fatigue and burnout and all of the responsibilities, as Kyle was saying, that are just like continuing to be built upon. I think when I really like what I think I would have needed is this vision of shared leadership with the youth, like shared responsibility, and how you can craft a classroom culture that makes youth want to step into the roles of leading our space together. And fundamentally, I think that could shift so many things within the systems. I think about when I did like kind of a restorative drop-in space type thing. So I was one of those, I guess you phrased it nicely, Kyle, as far as restorative interventionist, but also lots of other roles in one. But I think of some of my students who inevitably got put in like alt placement, who actually would have made it a fantastic peer mediator, right? Like their energy and enthusiasm could have been like one of the most amazing peer mediators at that school. And so like I wonder about ways to help some teachers unlearn ways of being and create some space for students to step into their roles of co-leadership and co-facilitation of the classroom space itself. As well as these other restorative lenses. Like I know administrators, like what a hard job and overwhelm and like constantly trying to keep up with things. And if we help the youth step into the roles that we're seeking to fill with adults, they inevitably are learning real world, future oriented skills that will help them move into their next phase of learning and being. And also are really talk about project-based learning. They are creating the community that we're seeking and desiring. So there's a lot to that, but first and foremost, kind of starting really small. What's a community building activity that I could create space for 2 people in my classroom to do today? And maybe we do it like once at the beginning and once in the middle for a little shake up, right? Because they get bored of listening to my voice. Or how, like, what little roles am I letting them take on? So those small steps maybe to start, and then there's so many beautiful ways to go from there. But first and foremost, starting with letting them step into their accountability of the fact that they can take on so much. And that frees up our time and space and energy levels to address all the other things that are needed. And yeah, I don't need to go into the white supremacy culture, but I wanted to for a little while when you brought that up earlier, but for another conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for your thoughts and contributions. I guess, like I said, this is just kind of, I believe that we're hitting on some issues that are really current right now in schools. And I agree with Meg that it's helpful and hopeful to connect with all of you, to kind of hear different opinions, and also to kind of take the temperature of what's going on, not only with other people, but in other schools and other organizations. And I guess, it seems like we could probably continue this conversation every month for a long time, but I guess just our last question and my last question to the whole panel is, what's something that I asked you at the beginning of the conversation, what's something hopeful or positive that you've experienced? And I guess, what's something that you might take away from this conversation that could be something hopeful or positive, in the next month or so? And one thing, I'll start, but one thing that is just kind of ringing a lot is this idea of language and how I'm using language with kids, and also sort of my processes, like when something is happening, how am I dealing with that, and what language will I be using, and can I change that language to be more positive and supportive? So even, I'll revert, even if I'm holding kids accountable or trying to have high expectations, which in and of itself might be a topic for another conversation. What kind of language can I use so that kids feel like they're not getting removed from the community, but that we're just trying to make them a better contributor to the community, right? And so that language is something that I hope focusing on. And then I'll move over to Kevin, and we'll kind of go back to our speaking order, and then we'll bring it to a close. Kevin?
Yeah, that the notion of having peers, take accountability over each other and just support each other in a lot of different ways. It's definitely something I want to think about moving forward. I know as a school, our administration direction center is doing way more just getting student input on how things are going. Specifically, like in the cafeteria, like they're having regular lunch meetings, just saying like, what can we do to change? I think that's super powerful. And it's hard, going back to the idea, it comes back to relationships. And, what we're struggling the most with is I feel like we're not seeing a lot of these behaviors on team with the 4 core teachers who we spend, again, years of developing these relationships with these kids and families. But it's like the second they're going off the world language, or when we have a sub in, I feel like we used to have that, when we wrote sub plans, we all knew the few kids that really thrived in relationships that were going to need check-ins when the new person was in. And now it feels like there's a few kids that we don't need to do that for. And the rest of the class is trying to make that person's life as hard as possible. And that's been a really tricky switch. So I think kind of bringing that more just peer connection of how can we check on each other when we're in this space where it's not somebody that we have a great relationship with or develop relationship with, what can we do to support each other and support that community at that time? So, we're not playing with this aftermath after the fact. I think that'd be super powerful. And I would love, new strategies for how to develop that with our kids.
Kev, that's so true. We have the same thing, right? It's it was a few, yeah. There's a couple things. Definitely the language piece, I think, is something I really want to pay attention to. I was sitting here while we were talking about that, thinking about, in special education, it used to be that graphic organizers were considered an accommodation, and now that's a universal accommodation, right? We do that all the time. And I know that there are behavior specialists and special educators that have systems that are used for kids that should be universal, right? It shouldn't just be, oh, this kid needs this 5-point scale. It's I think some of that can be a universal approach. And we've been talking about a little bit about that on our team. So I'd like to think about that a little bit more. And Katie, I really appreciate that idea of what are some small things. I see kids in here that have tremendous skills and talents and interests, and don't always find ways to just say, hey, can you help me? Can we do this part together? Or can you go, whatever it is, just letting, making the message so clear that this is shared space, and that, your role in contributing to it is equally as important as mine. So I want to think about that a lot.
Katie Ingraham?
Yeah, I am feeling very full from all the ideas. One that has come up a few times in the last few days is this idea of the podded structure from COVID, and it came up again today, and how some of my students that I had in that time still think, they're 11th graders now, they still think of that as one of their favorite times, and just the sanctity of story, and how when you have those smaller groups, so much more space is created for that, among many other things. Thanks, everybody. Pass it to other Katie. Or Kyle, sorry.
Yeah, I really appreciate the space for this conversation. It's been really great for me to get a broader perspective than my own on the work that I'm doing. So thank you for holding space for it. One thing that's I'm definitely thinking a lot about, kind of connecting to what Katie said around the pods, and why that went away. It went away out of a logistical need. I know that, but why did the mentality of the pod go away, and how do we bring that back? Because all those were just tighter, smaller communities, right? And that's really what we know is best. So how do we bring that back? And also thinking a little bit about what Katie Farber was saying about, when we had half as many people in the cafeteria, it was pretty easy to maintain expectations. And now that we got twice as many people, it's harder. But why is it harder? Is it the noise? Because twice as many people are going to make twice as much noise, right? So like reevaluating, like, what are our expectations? And I think that kind of plays into what you were saying, Dawn, about white supremacist culture of like, why do we have an expectation about exactly what the noise level should be? If we put 100 adults in a room, that would probably be just as loud. So, are we upholding fair and equitable expectations for students? And is that playing into, what teachers are feeling like they have to uphold, whether they feel that it's just or not? They're kind of in compliance mode too. So how do we reevaluate some of that?
Nice, Kyle. It makes me think of like just priorities. Like, what are your priorities? Are the priorities accomplishing the logistics that we used pre-COVID in terms of one person in the, or the priorities, for somebody to actually eat and have a conversation, right? Like, so, but yeah, I'm thinking a lot about what people are saying. Katie Ingram, when you said, like, I remember having the fifth graders work up to leading the morning meeting. And then you'd have two students that are leading it for the week, and they took it so seriously. And if they missed it, it was just awful. And there was just like, they got to plan the greeting, they got to plan the share, and they got to plan the activity/game. They got to do the announcements for the day. And it was just like, I guess I didn't really conceptualize it as how powerful it really was. And then the closing has that same potential. So you have 2 points. And then if they're helping co-construct, like, should we do this in this class or this? So like, if you didn't show up today, the community's not going to work as well. It's that loop, right? And then the conversation here has me thinking a lot about the white supremacy rush, scarcity. What are your deficits? What are your gaps? What is the shame? Okay. And if you're out, right? And the students are going to look for belongingness. And so where are they going to find it? They might find it in a hate group. They might find it, if this out piece, that compliance culture, we've seen what happens. We see it every day in the news. So how do we, I think it's revolutionary to give yourself, like Kyle said, the permission slip, to say what we learned from the pods, that close in relationship, being more flexible, not rushing, is is the medicine for some of these problems we're facing. So that's what I'm left thinking about. Thanks, folks.
I just really appreciate everybody's insights and the thought and the different ideas that are brought to the table are really, as people are talking, I'm thinking about my own classroom and different things that I could be doing in my own practice. And I guess that's the whole purpose of these conversations. I was tired and a little bit drawn out when I got on the call, and I feel very, very different now. And I appreciate everybody's contribution. We're going to end here. We're going to close, but I guess I just want to remind folks that the family conference is happening March 14th. Also, Up for Learning has racial justice dialogues on a monthly basis. The next one is March 15th. And then our next conversation will be on Thursday, March 23rd at 3:15. And the beauty of that for those classroom teachers out there is that there is a big fat vacation between now and then. And I'm sure that people are going to enjoy that. But just as a last closing, I just like people the one word to describe how you're doing, and then we'll just sign right off. But again, I deeply appreciate the professionalism and the knowledge and the wisdom that folks are sharing here. It really is helpful and very thought-provoking. So thank you. And I think that's my word, is thanks. And we'll go to Kevin, Katie, Kyle, Meg, and Katie Farber.
I'll say hopeful.
Grateful.
Optimistic.
Persistent.
Supportive.
Be well, everybody. Thanks for all the work. Take care.